So I'd just like to talk about some of the process in terms of developing the strategy. And first point is consultation with defence industry. The amount of pushback I'm hearing from a range of companies around the country says that if they were consulted, their views were not taken on board. So I'm interested to understand what consultation occurred in the development of the strategy.
Thank you very much, Senator. Chris Deeble, Deputy Secretary of CASG. I've taken over the responsibility for the domestic industry policy, but was not running that at that time. I may seek to get the part of the team that was running that at this point in time.
Yep, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hello, Senator. Kate Cameron, currently Assistant Secretary of AUKUS Initiatives, but I was leading the development of the DIDS as it was developed. Your question, please, Senator.
Normally when a policy gets rolled out, you'll get some people happy and some people unhappy, but I've had almost consistent disquiet from industry around the country as I've spoken to them, which says to me that if they were effectively consulted during the development of this strategy, their views were not listened to. But I would like to give you the opportunity to tell the committee what consultation occurred from your perspective and why is there this disconnect between something that was consulted, assuming it took notice of the consultation, and the very broad dissatisfaction within industry.
So, Senator, there was a large amount of consultation that had been conducted for around 12 months. Over 120 businesses in every state and territory, across states and territories, were engaged in workshops to be able to understand their views. Post that workshop, that fed initial findings and the foundation of the report. Post that, the team, including myself, had a number of one-on-one engagements with the industry to be able to receive their feedback and thoughts on critical issues. If there are specific issues that industry are concerned about, I'd be happy to discuss those with you.
Well, I think we've had a very long and detailed dialogue between, I think it was Senator Shoebridge and Senator Pocock earlier with Mr Deeble about one of the key concerns that's come back from Australian industry. But I'd like to just come back to the concept of consultation. I have seen consultations before, some from Defence, some from other departments or agencies within government, where essentially lots of people came and they were informed what was going to happen and a box was ticked, the consultation had occurred. And one of the remedies to that I have sought to push in other forums is for the opinions of stakeholders to be publicly listed so that when consultation occurs, the agency or department who are developing policy can indicate publicly how they have dealt with the principles or concerns that have been raised by stakeholders. Did that sort of process occur at all with the development of DIDS?
Certainly, as feedback was received from industry internally, it was captured and we were understanding how we would incorporate that into the development of the strategy. We didn't ever call for public submissions to then release on the website. It was really more of that one-on-one engagement and discussion was the approach that we used.
So if we asked you to provide the committee, even if it was in confidence or if we FOI'd the documents, would we find a mismatch between what industry said they wanted out of the policy and where you've ended up? Because that's certainly the feedback we're getting in, not all, but many areas of the policy.
Senator, if you could identify specific areas, and I'm happy to go to the definition of sovereignty if that would be helpful, and discuss the thinking behind that definition, but specifics would be helpful for me to be able to answer those questions.
Sure. So you've heard the discussion before about the disquiet around how we define sovereign,
yep,
because it goes to the point that there, even within the concept of minimum viable capability, which I know is not the defence industry terminology, that's come out of the DSR, but what industry are seeing is that speed of relevance, minimum viable capability and cost pressures are pushing defence just to buy offshore. And so they're saying we are not seeing contracts come through. And I've got a number of companies who are looking to leave the sector or significantly reduce their R&D and investment in the sector because they're seeing contracts going places other than Australian industry.
So in terms of the definition of sovereign, can I point out a couple of key aspects of that definition that I think are fundamental underpinnings to our understanding of what we mean by a sovereign defence industrial base. On page 2 of the Defence Industry Development Strategy, there's a definition of an industrial capability, and this is quite critical. As was part of testimony earlier today, it does talk to products or services, but it has 4 key attributes of those products and services, which really define what we mean by an industrial capability. They are business acumen, so knowledge, systems, administration to run an effective business, intellectual property, ownership of or sufficient access to, workforce, the right mix of suitably qualified people with experienced personnel, and capital, the necessary assets, space and facilities and inputs. And so the definition of the sovereign defence industrial base is that Australian-based industrial capability with those key aspects. So actually a really viable company that is going to contribute to defence. An ABN, as the testimony was identified earlier, that's really important so we can have a look at things like the Australian Bureau of Statistics and understand how that contributes to the industrial base. And products or services which can be used in or be adapted to be used in the Australian defence supply chain or international defence forces. It's also quite important to note some of the text on page 4, which is the following page from the definition, and that talks about robust risk mitigation frameworks, including Australia's foreign investment framework, to help ensure the resistance of the sovereign defence industrial base to foreign involvement risks. And so this idea that Australia's sovereign defence industrial base is nested within our other foreign investment considerations and is integrated into whole-of-government considerations is foundational to the Defence Industry Development Strategy.
Sure. So that's all good theory, and I understand and accept the fact that there are some people who are Australian companies who may be startups, who don't have a proven track record, that they may have even received a grant from the Australian government, but don't get a procurement contract, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction. But there are also many companies who do actually meet the capability requirements that were the terms of a grant and still don't get a procurement contract because they're not seen as having prior experience, etc., which flies in the face of the whole ASCA concept, in that if we're funding someone to develop something new, by definition, they're a startup, they don't have a track record, etc. And I know Mr. Deeble and I have talked about this before. So that's a separate category. But the third category are companies like I noticed Minister Miles last year, no, 2022, late 2022, signed an enterprise partnering agreement with Saab, which was a follow-on to one that I think it was Minister Reynolds signed back in 2019. I'm taking a guess there, maybe earlier. So that was a partnering arrangement where Defence said, we will help sustain this industry sector because they've proven. So there's those 3 segments. Okay, so industry have indicated that it's that second and third segment where people can develop something through something like ASCA, and if they meet the capability requirements, a contract will follow, because their point is contracts give us sustainability and the ability to invest in IP and people, and certainly those partnering agreements are fantastic. So can you talk to me why our industry policy is not connecting more fulsomely the innovation and the procurement pieces, and why we aren't making more of an effort to do what Minister Miles did in 2022 of signing things like EPAs with people like Pacific Marine Batteries?
If I could, just one comment before I ask Mr. Deeble, but the comment that you made, Senator, does concern me, that that there might be parts of defence industry that say that the department would just prefer to deal with a prime, and a foreign prime, because that is not the message that the senior leadership of the department, including DepSec CASG, DepSec National Naval Shipbuilding and the CIO in terms of the ICT projects. That is not the message that we are giving to program chiefs. So, I can understand that there might occasionally be that sort of comment for somebody who is asked to do subcontract work to a prime. That there's sometimes resentments there, but that is not the culture that we are seeking to drive in the department, in the procurement areas.
So, Mr Moretti, that may be not what you wish to drive, but from industry's perspective, when we have a lot of statements, and to be fair, across both sides of politics, that we want to develop sovereign capabilities where they do actually deliver capability to our warfighters, and we just heard earlier today from Chief of Navy that, for example, the 9LV combat system in conjunction with the CFAR radar, which the Commonwealth is now a significant shareholder of, is a world-leading capability. Even an EPA signed with Saab. But the head of naval capability, I think it was in the UK, at a conference came out very strongly and said for the general purpose frigate, there will be no design change. And what that means is that continuity of work, the whole purpose behind an EPA, the confidence that industry has that Defence will recognise their innovation, their success in global terms of capability, can just be swept aside, which then impacts on their ability to retain skills, to do further IP development, and worse, it actually decreases the capability for our warfighter. One of the reference ships in that list of 4, the Daegu FFX Batch 2, still has a rotating radar on it. We're going back to the dark ages in terms of the capability to our warfighters compared to what the ASMD on Anzac has with the CFAR radar. So where is the congruence between what is actually occurring in the procurement space and the statements within things like our defence industry development strategy, when industry sees those sorts of decisions that ignore capability outcomes and ignore the stated intent to actually build resilient capability where it is world leading, where it's value for money and makes sense and helps our warfighter?
Senator Chris Deeble, Deputy Secretary of CASG. I think there are a number of areas, and the document, the DIDS, attempts to bring these together in a coherent way to your point. And the sovereign defence industry priorities that are covered off in here is trying to provide a clear picture across 2 epochs of where we want to focus small to medium enterprise in particular to maintaining capability that is critical to Australia. There is a diagram that describes how we want to grow that mid-tier layer. And there's a combination then of how we're doing procurement reform, Chapter 5, the communications more broadly with industry, Chapter 6, and then we talk about the connection there to the innovation, Chapter 7, the need for security and then export. So inherent in this is this notion of taking innovation through capability like ASCA, where the key criteria for how we pick activity to be undertaken through ASCA is that it will have pull-through to capability. The key criteria in the sovereign defence industry priorities is to have a capability manager and a delivery manager that have responsibility for pulling that capability through into a capability outcome, a project. The other element of this is recognising that often the Australian demand doesn't get you to scale. And the way in which we will support industry there is creating export opportunity. So this notion of having innovation pulled through to capability, leveraged into export, is inherent in what's attempted here in the defence industry development strategy.
Again, I'm happy with that in theory, Mr Deeble. Can I ask a test case? We've just announced $100 million of additional support to Ukraine. 32.5 million of that was into the drone coalition, the UAV coalition, to support Ukraine. ASCA has just been running a program for Australian industry about UAVs. how much of that $32.5 million is developing the export opportunities for Australian industry to give them scale and sustainability, and how much of that is just being handed off to an international collaboration?
Well, there is 6 Australian companies represented in that $30 million that's going and providing UAV technology to the Ukraine, invested in Australian companies.
How much of the I know 6 companies, but how much of the 32.5 million is going to those 6 Australian
I'd
companies?
need to take that on notice specifically, but I believe it's the vast majority of that 30 million is going to those 6 companies. Some of those companies that were covered off by the ASCA work are part and parcel of the work that's supporting to Ukraine. I believe at least 2, but I'll happily take that on notice and provide you with that information.
Is there anyone else here who can answer that?
Senator, Tanya Munro, Chief Defence Scientist. Thank you for the question. This nexus of innovation and procurement reform is critical. ASCA, by only solving problems that are priorities, give industry signals that then can lead to procurement. So you raised the Sovereign UAS challenge that ASCA ran. Through that, we funded SMEs and both to work towards a fly-off, which happened in April, but also to develop procurement plans. And it's a pleasure to tell you that 4 of those companies now are ready to scale up in procurement. This is getting us ready to be able to take advantages of opportunities for Australian industry. I might pass to Emily Hilder for further detail if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm Emily Hilder, Head of the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator. As Professor Munro said there, one of the key things for our Sovereign UAS Challenge, and I know we've talked about this before, Senator, was to understand not only how we could get much needed capability, in particular this is for training needs within our ADF, but to understand how we could support industry to grow and scale. One of the most useful things that we found out of this and the feedback we've had from industry, I'm very happy to share that. We have actually quite a number of interviews with industry players who are involved in that, as they talked about it was one of their most positive experiences, SMEs engaging directly with Defence in a way that was fast, that was flexible, that took into account their needs. I think this ties very well when we start talking about things like support to Ukraine, where we provide ways that make it easier for these companies to engage and for us to understand also how we can do things much more rapidly and before we start thinking about how we scale these activities.
Cool. Well, that is good news, and that's a good test case, Mr. Deeble and Professor Hilder. Thank you. The Saab question for general purpose frigate. How do we reconcile the amount of money we have invested in CEA over the years, the testing that was done in Hawaii that proved this is a world-leading capability, particularly against the most significant threat that surface vessels face, which is high-speed, hypersonic, sea-skimming missiles, particularly launched in volleys, and the CFAR radar and 9LV gives the combination, the active control and combination that allows even a slow missile like the ESSM to defeat multiple threats. How can we justify going backwards in capability and leaving our vessels and sailors more vulnerable and at the same time stripping confidence from industry that things like EPAs actually mean anything?
Senator, I will ask Mr McDowell to talk to that, but the government's overriding priority with that class of vessels was get hulls in the water. So it was
So might be very deep in the water, though, Mr. Moriarty.
Speed to delivery.
Yeah, so Jim McDowell, Deputy Secretary, National Shipbuilding and Sustainment. The trade-off is one that is made. That is the overriding. The first criterion is to get capability, minimum viable capability into service as quickly as possible. Therefore, one of the trades that you might make for that is exotic capability that would have to be retrofitted to an already established design, which, as we know, is the basic criterion for those 4 ships, the 4 exemplar ships, which were recommended by the independent review. First criterion, speed to capability, speed to minimum viable capability. Therefore, you will have no design changes therefore you will get your capability there. It will not be an objective capability perhaps, but it will be a minimum viable capability, and it will be got there many years sooner than if we had to retrofit the design of a CEA radar. And I'd also say that CEA radar was not in the original design of the Anzac frigate. So it was something that came along later, and there is nobody saying that as these ships go through life that they will not, in the normal usage and upkeep cycle, as we saw with Anzac through their life, be upgraded, be made better ships. But for the moment, the instruction from government is minimum viable capability as soon as possible.
So that's a trade-off that you're making, which meets a government objective, but it also exposes our sailors and our capital naval vessels to increased risk, given that the preeminent threat is those sea-skimming missiles, when we have a capability here in Australia that has been proven to be the best in the world, which we have invested in. I don't see how that trade-off makes sense when we can still provide, in a similar time frame, vessels with that capability installed.
I think I'll not talk to the capability question. I'll leave that to the Chief of Navy with regard to capability. But there is simply no way that we could design and redesign those exemplar ships to take a CEA radar or a 9LV and still get them in the water, commissioned, in service with the Royal Australian Navy in the timescales that were being demanded, that were being recommended by government. And yes, you might get a better ship a few years later, but for that period of time, then you're actually worse off because you have no ships in the water, even with a minimum viable capability. We also have other assets which does have CEA radar and 9LV on it.
Sure. So we're only talking about industry capability here, so I won't go too far on that, except to say that if we take the Commander of Indo-PACOM as being a somewhat informed and interested party in this, his assessment was peak threat is 2028. So if we had those vessels in the water, even with a substandard capability at scale by 2027 to give time for introduction to naval service training, etc., the argument might stand, but we're not getting them until into the 2030s, which is probably past the period of peak threat. So I'm not convinced by the argument. So can I come back to then what feedback have you had since DIDS has been published in February from industry? Have you gone out actively seeking feedback, not just from AIDEN and the sort of AIG type groups, but from defence industry more broadly?
Senator, since the DIDS was issued, we have done a range of engagements, both with peak bodies, with state advocacy and other areas. Clearly, at the time when the DIDS was delivered in the February timeframe, industry was awaiting the outcomes of the National Defence Strategy and the Defence Integrated Investment Plan. Those three come together, and as noted by Major General Rawlins before, they'll be updated on a biannual basis moving forward for good reason. And as I noted before, the National Defence Strategy sets the capability priority. The DIIP enacts it with projects. The DIDS will link that to the outcomes that we will be seeking. I think the review on consideration of the sovereign defence industry priorities, industry feedback has been good in that regard, but there will need to be more work done to put more meat on the bone and the specificity that's required to really guide industry outcomes and to make clear where we want those industry priorities to be set across the two epochs that are covered off in the sovereign defence industry priority activity. Sitting in Chapter 6 of the DIDS is the communication strategy, and we have just put together a calendar of events where we will regularly engage with industry throughout the remaining year and in years to come, which will include more regular engagement with industry, And as we have done with the DIIP, we have engaged in both an unclassified and classified levels with industry, and in particular those industries that were impacted, again along the lines that Major General Rawlins described. So the engagement is picking up. It will continue at pace throughout the remainder of the year and into the future.
So could you take on notice to provide to the committee, de-identified so we protect privacy, but the feedback that you are getting post the launch of DIDS so that the committee can see what industry is actually telling you. We can then judge the response that Defence makes in terms of your development or application of DIDS in response to that. Two final questions, because the Chair is trying to wind me up here. With the new Sovereign Capability Grants program, when will that be announced, and how is that different to the old Sovereign Industrial Capability Priority grants?
Two parts to the question. I'll answer the question on the Defence Industry Development Grant process moving forward. By mid-year, we've already provided guidance and expectations to the Minister for his consideration. We'll kick off from the middle of this year. We have about $150 million. I know that the DIDS talks about a greater number. That's because there was some extant grant funding that we still had underway, and we will continue that new process into the future. That will be administered under my leadership into the future and closely engage with DISA as we look to how we choose that. There's 4 key areas for those grants: looking at capability uplift and capacity building, looking at export opportunity, looking at security uplift and skilling and STEM aspects. So that will be announced and in play by the middle of this year.
So we had evidence before from Professor Hilda that under the ASCA program, in terms of the EW Challenge, I think is the name of the program, that was open to anyone in the world because we, under the Commonwealth procurement rules, weren't able to exclude them. So in this grant program, are you limiting this to companies who are genuinely SMEs with Australian people, Australian IP, etc., or is this also open to anyone in the world who wants to come and establish a footprint here? So DJI, for example, Defence has used DJI drones, or the camera company, whatever they were called, that had the cameras around Defence bases. Defence saw a purpose for those. If they decide to manufacture a component of that here with an ABN, could they apply for it? Could a prime from the States apply for it if they have a footprint here? How are we actually discriminating so we're benefiting Australian companies? This is not an ask a question. This is a...
No, I just wanted to clarify my testimony from before, Senator. It's not open to any company. It's open to any company that meets the definition of sovereign industry as in DID. So they have to have an ABN and a footprint in Australia.
Sure, but their profit and loss line could still go offshore. Because I hark back to your predecessor, Mr Deeble, during COVID, when Defence decided that cash flow to industry was important and mandated that payments had to go through to SMEs in a certain time frame so they stayed viable. And the interesting aspect was that almost every company that had P&L responsibility here in Australia responded quickly, but there were a number of companies who had to go back to boards and CEOs overseas that months later were still not compliant. And I think that's a very powerful lesson in terms of sovereign means people who care about Australia and the outcomes here and will respond in accordance to government direction and requests, as opposed to those who are actually beholden at the end of the day to people who have interest elsewhere.
But in response to your specific question, Senator, this is aimed at companies that are less than 200 people as defined for small to medium enterprise. And it's important to note the 4 areas that I talked about before. So growing the capacity and capability of that small to medium enterprise base, looking at those export opportunities, critical to getting to scale, upskilling and training, similar to what was done under the old SADI program, but now repurposed in this context. And more critical, and what wasn't in that grants program previously, was the security accreditation, which is definitely aimed at bringing small to medium enterprise, up in the security standards. I'd note that about 97% of our small to medium enterprise base that is part of the Defence Industry Security Program are entry level, and that won't be appropriate if we're looking at them helping us develop asymmetric and disruptive capability. We don't want it compromised from the get-go. So this is why we're focusing on that security uplift and why specifically security is covered off in the DIDs in that regard.
Thank you, Mr.